Hi everyone, and welcome to week 8 of our Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde GCSE revision series. What we're doing in these lessons is we're going through all of the major characters, themes, key quotes, model paragraphs and answers, and context to make sure that you have all the tools and skills that you need to do your best in the GCSEs. For some of you are getting very, very close now. So if that's the sort of content you think would be useful for you, then please consider going back through this series and maybe some of my other series on other texts like Macbeth, Lord of the Flies, poetry. I've got a whole English language series as well that could be useful. So yeah, feel free to check any of that out if it helps. We've gone through Utterson, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Dr. Lanyon, the theme of good versus evil, violence, and duality of nature so far in the preceding 7 weeks. So, if any of that sounds good, make sure you go check those videos out. Today, we're going to continue on by looking at the theme of repression. Now, repression is a pretty big deal in this novella. And I think that it's something that whether you get it as a direct theme question or you just get a question on Mr. Hyde, well, literally any of the characters, actually, literally Jekyll, Hyde, Lanyon, or Utterson, I think talking about the repression that they show is a really good idea to boost your marks. And it's also a really good theme or sort of part of the novel when you're thinking about linking it to the context of the play. So think about it this way. So obviously, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, written in Victorian England, by a Scottish man, by Robert Louis Stevenson. And he's writing at a time when it's a society, Victorian society, filled with repression, but at the same time filled with hidden expression and hidden, what we might call hidden sin, right? Like hidden darkness, effectively, yeah? So whilst on the surface, it was seen as very immoral and wrong to be a drunkard, alcoholic, drinking a lot. In the same way, I suppose, to some extent it is today, but more so than that, right? Where, people, if they drank to excess and they said things they shouldn't, or they, did things they shouldn't, it was much more condemned in Victorian society. So drinking was very repressed. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is the case. But at the same time as drinking being repressed in Victorian society, there was a huge amount of alcoholism in London at this time. We're still at this point in history coming out of what were called the gin riots. And the gin riots sound like both a really sort of fun, crazy time to be in London, just like a non-stop 24/7 party, people just hammered drunk all the time. But at the same time, also just a horrific time where women were literally certain women, men obviously as well, but my point is women were so addicted to alcohol, they would sometimes sell their own children for a bottle of gin, right? Men, no doubt, addicted to and doing awful things for alcohol too, but that's one of the examples that stuck with me. Just a horrific time. And there is a little bit of pointing towards that in this novella. They talk about how there are lots of women taking up their morning glass in the alleyways, right? And so that is the opposite of repression. So you've got the Victorian gentlemen who are like trying not to drink too much. You've got Utterson, for example, who drinks gin to mortify his taste for vintages. So, he has a glass of gin because he doesn't really like it that much, because otherwise he would probably have a bottle or two of wine because he really likes that. So basically drinks gin to stop himself from getting drunk. Yeah. So that's the Victorian gentlemen that are repressing themselves to some extent. But at the same time, you've then got these men and women on the streets who are rip-roaring drunk all the time. There was also prostitution. That was a huge problem in, it still is a huge problem, but was probably even more of a problem back in the 1800s, partly because of the class division and stuff. So particularly if you were a young woman in the Victorian era and you were unmarried, you would really struggle to get work. Unmarried and maybe not with family anymore, you would really struggle to get work to support yourself outside of prostitution. So one of the major ways you would make money is sell your body for money. And 1 in 5, this is something I looked up for today, and this is really scary. So there's a sexually transmitted disease called syphilis, very, very horrible sexually transmitted disease. 1 in 5 people over the age of 35 had syphilis. around the time that this was written, preceding this, and still about 10% quite soon after this. So imagine 1 in 5 and then 1 in 10 people having this really bad sexually transmitted disease. That shows just how much repression there was to do with sex and sexuality in Victorian times, but also how much people were undercover going out and doing these activities. Yeah. And that the reason I'm building all of this up is I want you to understand that a lot of this is to do with Dr. Jekyll, right? Dr. Jekyll is so severely repressed in his life that he then goes and does these terrible things as Mr. Hyde. And he can't even bring himself to acknowledge that he is Mr. Hyde. He sort of says, oh, Mr. Hyde goes off and do all these bad things, and then I wake up and I didn't do them, right? And it's like, well, you did, because you are Hyde, like it's a part of you. It's the repressed part that's coming out. Anyway, there's also was a lot of use of drugs. I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson himself, who wrote this, obviously, at the time he was writing this, he was dying of tuberculosis. And one of the drugs that Victorian doctors would have given to people in terrible pain would have been cocaine. So there's a lot of people who believe, and he also wrote this novella, this whole book in 3 days, right? So a lot of people do believe he was pretty high on cocaine himself when he did this to get rid of the pain. But there are also what were known as opium dens all over London. So reputable Victorian gentlemen like Dr. Jekyll would have gone to these opium dens. And opium is heroin. So they'd have literally been smoking heroin in these rooms and just getting all high and passing out all over the place. So, again, clearly within Victorian society, that is a big no-no, repressed. You're a Victorian gentleman, don't do any of that. But then under the surface, a lot of them were doing that stuff. So I think thinking about this, on balance, what I think one of the morals of this story is that extreme repression of things can lead to that people actually doing more of those bad things. It's kind of like a spring, right? Like if you push down on a spring, it's actually going to bounce up more than if you just leave the spring, unrepressed. It's just going to sort of sit there, chill on the desk or whatever. Working class suppression and upper class repression. I just want to talk about that for a minute. So one of the other reasons perhaps why a lot of the bad behavior in the novel that's sort of seen on the outskirts, like the women drinking their gin in the morning and the schoolboys using their knives on the carvings of the buildings, maybe one of the reasons we see all that is because the working class were very suppressed at that time. They didn't have very much opportunity in the Victorian era, really. The middle and upper class had a lot, though. But they were then repressed. So they had all these opportunities to make brilliant lives for themselves. Jekyll becomes a doctor, for example, right? But they were repressed because they were looked up to like people expected them to be basically perfect. They expected them to settle down, have wives and children, rarely drink, never do drugs, never obviously cheat on their wives, etc., etc. They were expected to be model citizens, and a lot of them just couldn't live up to that. Okay, so that's a pretty good chunk on repression. Hopefully that helps you understand what it is. I suppose we've talked a lot about how repressed Jekyll was. Mr. Utterson, I think, deals a lot better with repression. I think that he actually pretty much doesn't feel that he needs to do a lot of these things, which is one of the reasons why he's one of the more heroic characters in the book, in the novel. And I suppose there are just a few moments, though, where maybe he is starting to express himself a bit more. So at the beginning, he drinks gin to mortify his taste for vintages. Towards the end, he's sat in his room having a big glass of wine. And then it's in The Last Night, the chapter called The Last Night, I think chapter 8. And then Paul comes in and he gives Paul a big glass of wine. So we get this sense that the stress of everything in the novel is maybe getting to Utterson as well. And maybe he's drinking more and he's drinking more wine that he enjoys. So you do get a sense that all the characters have some level of repression which they push against. Yeah. Okay, so let's go into some key quotes and talk about that together. So, hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life, So this is a really interesting quote on repression, because this is Dr. Jekyll. And what he's saying here is he realizes that even before he became Mr. Hyde, he did all these things that actually did sort of go against the Victorian gentleman status, right? So he says he stood already committed to a duplicity of life. So he always was doing some bad things. We don't know what the bad things are as well. So it leaves it quite open. Was Dr. Jekyll someone who engaged in excessive drinking? Maybe. Was he someone who engaged in prostitution? Maybe. Was he someone who engaged in drugs? Maybe. Was he someone who, engaged in violence and harming others? Maybe. Don't know. It's left open, but we know that he admits that he was doing some of these bad things, even though we don't know what they were. I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil, which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. So one of the major quotes in the novel, if you can only remember a short bit of this, is my devil had been long caged, he came out roaring, because his devil, so to speak, is all of these things that he wants to go out and do, even though he's repressed and shouldn't do them. So we never really know what it is with Jekyll. Based on the actions of Mr. Hyde, we get a sense that Jekyll's major evil or wish to do evil is actually violence, because a lot of what Mr. Hyde does is violent. We don't really see Mr. Hyde engaging in prostitution or drugs or drinking specifically. We see him trampling on a little girl. We see him killing Sir Danvers Carew. We see him smacking a woman in the face. So we see a lot of violence in him. So I think that that's just my best guess of what Dr. Jekyll is talking about when he says his devil had been long caged. But maybe he was into other things too. So for example, in the last night, Mr. Utterson says to Paul, because Paul thinks that there's this deformed creature that is in the cabinet, right? It's not Dr. Jekyll, it's some deformed creature. And Mr. Utterson says, at first, Mr. Utterson says, well, maybe he's got some malady that is deforming him and affecting his brain. Now, my best guess at that, almost certainly, is he's talking about syphilis, because the way that syphilis affects the body over time, and I don't want to freak anyone out, it's almost an eradicated disease at this point, and there is medication to help people today for this, but at that time there was no medication. So uncured, untreated syphilis, basically it's a bacteria that would slowly eat away at your body and eventually eat away at your brain. So your face and skin and everything would go all deformed, and your brain eventually would become more and more affected. So you would become more and more erratic and more aggressive and more nonsensical until it killed you. It would kill you, right? So you'd have these people in London at the time that were literally they would seem like raving lunatics. They would just be on the streets of London shouting and screaming and who knows what, right? And the reason for that is because their brains were literally being attacked and slowly killed off by the syphilis. So I think that Utterson saying that to Paul, he's not saying that Dr. Jekyll necessarily did anything wrong, but he's maybe sort of suggesting he's got some malady, he's got some illness that's, deforming him and affecting him. And the only one that I think that really anyone would have assumed at that point would be syphilis. So Utterson is maybe subtly being like, oh, maybe Dr. Jekyll has, engaged in some prostitution or some sexual activity that he shouldn't have, and therefore he is now syphilitic. So that's pretty messed up, isn't it? As for the rest of it, what I find interesting is the fact that he compares himself to a drunkard. So the thing about alcohol is, one of the reasons why people are alcoholics, there are many reasons, and it's very sad, but one of the reasons is because it can numb pain, because if you're really drunk, you can't really feel anything. And it can also lower your inhibitions, make you do things that you wouldn't normally do soberly. So I think the reason Jekyll says this is because it's talking about repression again. So when he drinks the potion and he becomes Mr. Hyde, he removes all of his inhibitions. So he goes from a repressed Victorian gentleman to an expressive monster who will engage in these activities that he wants to deep down engage in. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. So here's a really interesting quote, because this is Mr. Hyde. And Mr. Hyde, this is after Mr. Hyde has trampled on the little girl in the first chapter. And even though Mr. Hyde is not a repressed character in any real way, he does allow himself to be repressed in this scene or in this chapter by society. He doesn't want to be caught and shamed for trampling on the little girl. So he'd rather pay the £100 bribe to the family to keep it all quiet. Yeah. And that's another thing about repression in Victorian times. A lot of these Victorian gentlemen, they could do these things and they could just pay off anyone that might talk out against them. So that is that one, and that links to some repression in Mr. Hyde. Even Mr. Hyde is scared of what society will think of him, or getting caught for doing these things that he should not be doing. Hosts loved to detain the dry lawyer when the light-hearted and loose-tongued had already their foot on the threshold. They liked to sit a while in his unobtrusive company, practicing for solitude, sobering their minds in the man's rich silence after the expense and strain of gaiety. So this is really interesting again. Everyone is talking about how they like to sit with Mr. Utterson just because Mr. Utterson is so able to repress his feelings and just be quiet and sober. And so Mr. Utterson, as I say, maybe shows some elements of going away from that repression, like drinking the wine and stuff, but mostly he's a very model Victorian gentleman. And Dr. Jekyll can't live up to him, and neither can really anyone else. He's almost too good to be true, too heroic. But at the end, what's really I like as well is the expense and strain of gaiety. So the word expense and the word strain suggests that there is a cost to having happiness in Victorian society. It almost suggests that Victorian society was built in a way that you weren't really supposed to have fun, because the word gaiety just means sort of happiness. So the idea that being happy was expensive and straining in this society, again, just shows what a repressed place Victorian England was. Okay, final quote, and then we'll do our model paragraph like usual. So a great curiosity came on the trustee to disregard the prohibition and dive at once to the bottom of these mysteries. But professional honor and faith to his dead friend were stringent obligations, and the packet slept in the inmost corner of his private safe. So once again, this is when Utterson has received letters from Lanyon, also letters from Jekyll, and he won't open them because of his professional honor. So again, Utterson is just shown as this character who actually is a model of how Victorians are supposed to be. But that doesn't mean he's perfect. He wants to go against his repression, but luckily he finds the strength not to, and to stay professional. Okay, so there are a few quotes for you on repression. Hopefully that helps you understand it a bit better. We're going to finish, as always, with a little model paragraph on this. So how significant is repression in the novella? So one of the major ways that repression is used in a significant fashion in the novella is through the way that Dr. Jekyll speaks about his repression and subsequent choices to become Mr. Hyde. We note this in the quote. We note this in the quote. I do not suppose that a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice. Okay, I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, ... By calling him, by using this symbolism and comparing himself to a drunkard, we see clearly that Dr. Jekyll knows that what he is doing is deeply wrong and harmful, both to himself and others. However, much like an alcoholic, due to the repression of his past and through the imagery of his father, due to the repression of his past, he cannot stop becoming Mr. Hyde. This is very significant because it linked strongly to the Victorian society. The paradoxical Victorian society. On the one hand, Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll, no, sorry. On the one hand, Victorian society looked down upon prostitution, alcoholism, drug use, and so on. On the other, it was a time of great drunkenness, lewd prostitution, and opium dens. Stevenson is perhaps implying that too much repression will inevitably lead to people seeking ways to fulfill their dark pleasures in the same way that Jekyll creates Hyde. Okay, so there we go. That's a model paragraph for you on how repression is used, how it's significant. We looked at Dr. Jekyll, we looked at how he compares himself to a drunkard, and then we linked it really strongly to context. So that would be a pretty decent model paragraph in the exam. So I hope that was helpful. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, please do leave them down below. And I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much, everyone.